When a 19-year-old walked into court alone, everyone laughed, until he revealed he was smarter than all of them combined. The courtroom was abuzz with the quiet murmurs of restless spectators, their attention shifting between the imposing judge at the bench and the young man standing nervously by the defense table. The walls of the Kingsford County Courthouse bore the weight of countless past verdicts, but today the tension in the air felt unusually charged. All eyes were on 19-year-old Mason Reed, a slim, unassuming figure in an ill-fitted shirt and a pair of scuffed sneakers. He clutched a few disheveled papers in his hands, his knuckles whitening under the pressure. Behind the bench sat Judge Eleanor Monroe, a name synonymous with authority and sharp rebukes. Her reputation as a no-nonsense jurist preceded her. She wasn't one to mince words, and her courtroom was no place for theatrics or excuses. To her, this case seemed trivial, another young person wasting the court's time. She didn't hide her disdain as she peered over her glasses at Mason. "Mr. Reed," she began, her tone clipped, "you do realize that the court does not take kindly to individuals showing up unprepared, don't you?" Mason cleared his throat, a faint tremble in his voice. "Yes, Your Honor. I do." The faint chuckle from the gallery wasn't lost on him, nor was the judge's subtle smirk. It was the look of someone who had already decided the outcome before the proceedings had even begun. Judge Monroe leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Very well. Proceed. Mr. Reed, let's see what you've got." From the outset, it looked like a case destined for failure. Mason, representing himself in a minor traffic dispute, appeared as though he had wandered into the wrong room. But what everyone dismissed as naivety was something far more remarkable, a secret that would unravel before their very eyes. As Mason opened his mouth to speak, what followed left the room in stunned silence. Mason inhaled deeply, his fingers tightening around the edges of his papers. The weight of the room pressed on him, hundreds of eyes, each one scrutinizing, doubting, judging. Judge Monroe tapped her pen against the desk, her impatience palpable. "Mr. Reed," she said, arching an eyebrow, "if you're not ready to proceed, I'll be forced to dismiss this case. You understand that, don't you?" A ripple of muted laughter spread across the gallery. Mason lifted his gaze, his voice steady despite the nerves etched across his face. "I'm ready, Your Honor." Judge Monroe sighed and gestured for him to begin. "Then get on with it." Mason stepped forward, the shuffle of his worn sneakers echoing in the hushed courtroom. He glanced briefly at the opposition, a seasoned attorney with decades of experience etched in his confident posture. The man gave Mason a dismissive smile, as if to say, "This will be quick." Mason began recounting the incident that brought him to court, a disputed speeding ticket. But instead of fumbling through a generic defense, he outlined the events with striking precision, referencing timestamps, road conditions, and even the officer's exact position when the ticket was issued. His delivery was deliberate, and while his tone remained humble, there was an unmistakable confidence building beneath his words. The judge leaned forward slightly, her pen slowing as she jotted notes. Mason continued, citing a statute from the state's vehicle code with startling accuracy. "According to Section 40802B, Your Honor, the method used to determine my speed may not be admissible under the conditions stated by the law." Judge Monroe's brow furrowed. She hadn't expected him to pull out a specific statute, let alone use it effectively. The courtroom, too, began to shift. What had initially been mild amusement turned into quiet intrigue. The opposing lawyer cleared his throat, interrupting, "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The statute doesn't apply to this case." Mason didn't falter. "With all due respect, it does apply, and if I may..." He walked to the evidence table, pulling out a diagram he had sketched himself. It wasn't flashy, but it was detailed, every angle, every distance accounted for. "This diagram shows why the radar used couldn't have accurately captured my speed from where the officer was stationed." Judge Monroe blinked, caught between skepticism and genuine surprise. Mason had just challenged the expertise of the opposing counsel, and done so convincingly. But as Mason turned back to the gallery, he wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning of his case. The courtroom, which had been restless moments ago, fell into a silence thick enough to feel. Mason glanced around, his eyes briefly meeting the curious stares of the gallery before locking back onto the judge. His voice grew steadier, and with each word, a quiet confidence seemed to bloom. "Your Honor," he continued, his tone now firm, "the foundation of this case rests on the credibility of the evidence presented. If the evidence is flawed, then so is the charge against me." He turned to the opposing counsel, his words respectful but pointed. "May I ask if the prosecution can confirm the calibration of the radar gun used during the stop?" The seasoned attorney shifted in his seat, clearly caught off guard. "We do not have that documentation readily available, Your Honor, but it's standard procedure." "So?" Mason held up his hand slightly, not to interrupt but to ask permission to proceed. Judge Monroe, her curiosity now piqued, nodded. "Standard procedure isn't proof," Mason replied. "The law requires verification, not assumptions. Without that calibration record, the evidence cannot be considered reliable." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. People whispered among themselves, no longer laughing at the young man who had walked in looking like he didn't belong. Even Judge Monroe seemed to take a breath before addressing him again. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice softer than before, "you seem to have a deeper understanding of legal processes than most. Where did you learn this?" Mason hesitated for a moment, then said, "I've been studying law since I was 13, Your Honor. I passed the bar last year." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the opposing attorney raised his eyebrows in disbelief. Judge Monroe leaned forward, her expression hard to read. "You're telling me you're a licensed attorney at your age?" "Yes, Your Honor. I've always had a passion for law." Mason paused, glancing down at his papers before looking back up, his voice unwavering. "I also know how people see me when I walk into a room. They assume I don't belong." The judge straightened in her chair, her demeanor shifting. For the first time, the doubt in her expression gave way to something else, respect. Mason pressed on, presenting more evidence and carefully dismantling the opposing arguments. He referenced case law with ease, articulating legal precedent in a way that had even the most skeptical spectators nodding along. He cross-examined the officer's report, pointing out inconsistencies in the narrative. Each point he made was met with either stunned silence or murmurs of approval. But as the courtroom marveled at Mason's brilliance, one question still lingered. How far could he push this case, and the assumptions people had made about him? The tension in the room reached its peak as Mason presented his final argument. He stood straight, his voice unwavering, and his demeanor now exuded the quiet authority of someone far beyond his years. The courtroom, once filled with dismissive chuckles and skeptical glances, now hung on to his every word. "Your Honor," Mason said, his tone calm yet commanding. "This case is not just about a speeding ticket. It's about fairness, about ensuring that every individual, regardless of their appearance or age, is afforded the same standard of justice." His words landed heavily, silencing the last of the murmurs in the gallery. Judge Monroe leaned forward, her chin resting on her hand as she studied Mason. Her sharp demeanor had softened considerably, though her eyes remained critical. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Reed?" Mason took a steadying breath. "I'm suggesting that the evidence presented is not only unreliable, but that it violates the principles of due process. Without proper calibration records, the radar's accuracy is in question. Without consistent reporting, the officer's testimony is incomplete. And without clear evidence, this case should not proceed." The opposing attorney stood abruptly, his voice tinged with frustration. "Your Honor, this is absurd. He's twisting technicalities too." Judge Monroe raised a hand, silencing him. "Sit down, counselor," she said firmly. Her gaze returned to Mason. "Continue." Mason nodded and held up his papers. "I've prepared a motion to dismiss the charges based on these deficiencies. The law isn't about technicalities. It's about facts, evidence, and justice." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Judge Monroe reviewed the motion, flipping through its pages with a furrowed brow. Finally, she placed it down and looked up at Mason. "This is," she began, her voice trailing off. She adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "This is remarkably well prepared, Mr. Reed. Far beyond what I've seen from most first-year attorneys." The gallery erupted into whispers again, but a quick rap of Judge Monroe's gavel silenced them. She turned to the opposing attorney, who looked visibly flustered. "Counselor, do you have a rebuttal?" The attorney stood, but his hesitation was evident. "No, Your Honor. The defense has presented a compelling argument." Judge Monroe's gaze returned to Mason. For a moment, her usual sternness softened. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice carrying an unexpected warmth, "I misjudged you when you first walked into this courtroom. You have not only demonstrated a thorough understanding of the law, but have also reminded us all of its purpose. I hereby grant your motion to dismiss the charges." The sound of her gavel echoed in the room, followed by a moment of stunned silence. Then a slow ripple of applause began in the gallery, growing louder as spectators rose to their feet. Mason looked around, his face a mix of relief and disbelief. Judge Monroe stood as well, her expression unreadable. "Court is adjourned," she said before stepping down from the bench. But as she passed Mason, she paused and extended her hand. "You have a bright future ahead of you, Mr. Reed. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Mason shook her hand, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means a lot." As Mason left the courtroom that day, he didn't realize this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge and inspire far beyond those walls.